Welcome back. Today we'll uncover one of the most desperate and tragic chapters of the Pacific War, the story of the Kamikaze carriers, Japan's floating suicide platforms in the final year of World War II. By 1944, Japan's once mighty navy had been shattered. The carriers that had launched Pearl Harbor were gone, their planes destroyed at Midway and in the battles that followed. The American juggernaut, with its endless carriers, planes, and submarines, dominated the seas. In this hopeless situation, Japanese commanders turned to a weapon born of desperation, the kamikaze. The word meant divine wind, and these suicide pilots were tasked with slamming their planes, loaded with bombs, directly into Allied warships. The results were horrifying: ships torn apart by fire, men burned alive, fleets thrown into chaos. But even this was not enough for Japan's high command. They began converting carriers, light carriers, and escort ships into kamikaze platforms, launching wave after wave of pilots who knew they would never return. One of the most infamous examples came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Japan used its remaining carriers, including Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, not to fight, but as bait. They launched what planes they could, many manned by kamikaze pilots, but their true purpose was to lure the American fleet away from the landing zones. These once proud carriers sailed knowing they were sailing to destruction. And one by one, they were sunk under American fire. As the war dragged into 1945, more desperate conversions appeared. Small carriers like Shinyo and Kaiyo were turned into one-way launch pads, carrying planes for kamikaze strikes against the American armada off Okinawa. They rarely survived long, but each sortie inflicted fear. Even mighty American battleships like USS Bunker Hill and USS Franklin were crippled by suicide strikes that came from these carriers. Yet in the end, the kamikaze carriers could not change the tide. For every ship struck, America built 5 more. For every pilot lost, Japan's skies grew emptier. By the summer of 1945, the suicide carriers had been destroyed, their sacrifice in vain, their missions remembered only as symbols of a nation's desperation. The kamikaze carriers were not about victory, they were about defiance. They sailed knowing they were doomed, their decks filled with men flying to certain death. In those final days, they became floating tombs, their stories echoing the tragedy of a navy that once ruled the Pacific, now consumed by flames of its own making. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the kamikaze carriers reached their most dramatic moment. Japan's navy, desperate to halt the American invasion of the Philippines, launched Operation Shogo, a last gamble involving nearly every ship it had left. The plan was simple but suicidal: sacrifice what remained of the carrier force to draw away Admiral Halsey's powerful American task force, leaving American transports vulnerable to attack from Japanese battleships and cruisers. Leading this decoy was Zuikaku, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Once the pride of the Imperial Navy, she now sailed into battle with barely enough planes and pilots to fill her decks. Many of those she carried were kamikazes, trained for one-way missions against American ships. By the time she left port, her crew knew she was never coming home. On October 25th, off Cape Engano, Zuikaku and 3 light carriers, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuho, launched their handful of planes into the sky. Most never returned. American Hellcats shot them down before they reached their targets, and the few that broke through inflicted little damage. But the sacrifice served its purpose. Halsey, convinced he was facing the main Japanese carrier force, raced north with his battleships and carriers, leaving the landing beaches exposed. The plan nearly succeeded. Elsewhere, Japanese battleships and cruisers smashed into the American escort carriers off Samar, leading to the heroic stand of USS Johnston and other destroyers. But even as the battle raged, the fate of the kamikaze carriers was sealed. Waves of American aircraft from Task Force 38 descended on them. Bombs and torpedoes tore through their decks. Zuikaku fought bravely, her crew manning anti-aircraft guns as flames spread across the ship. With her colors flying high, she rolled to her side and sank beneath the waves, taking more than 800 men with her. One by one, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zoho followed, their wrecks joining her on the ocean floor. In a single day, the Japanese carrier force ceased to exist. Those great ships, once the spearhead of an empire, had been reduced to decoys and suicide platforms. Their destruction at Cape Engano marked not just the end of a battle, but the end of Japanese carrier aviation itself. The kamikaze carriers had fulfilled their grim destiny, to die so that others might strike. But their sacrifice could not change the tide. The American fleet pressed on, the Philippines were liberated, and Japan's last hope sank with Zuikaku and her sisters into the depths of the Philippine Sea. By 1945, Japan had been pushed back to its home waters, and the desperate use of kamikaze carriers reached its final, tragic phase. With the great fleet carriers gone, the Imperial Navy began converting smaller vessels, escort carriers, training carriers, even passenger liners refitted with flight decks, into platforms whose sole purpose was to launch suicide planes. One of these was Shinyo, a converted passenger ship outfitted to carry kamikazes. She sailed with only a handful of planes and minimal defenses, intended not for fleet battles but for desperate one-way strikes against the massive American armada closing in on Okinawa. Others, like Kaiyo and Shinyo, were used in similar roles, launching pilots who knew their fate before they ever left the deck. During the Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, waves of kamikaze aircraft screamed down on American carriers and destroyers. Some were launched from these suicide carriers, while others came from airfields on Kyushu. The attacks were terrifyingly effective. USS Bunker Hill was gutted by fire, USS Franklin nearly sank after direct hits, and dozens of destroyers were damaged or sunk. For American sailors, the word kamikaze became synonymous with sudden death from the sky. But for Japan, this was only a death spiral. Every strike consumed pilots and planes that could not be replaced. The carriers themselves were hunted down one by one. Submarines torpedoed Shinyo in November 1944, exploding her fuel stores and killing over 1,000 men. Others were sunk in harbor or by air raids before they could even sail. By August 1945, when Japan finally surrendered, not a single kamikaze carrier remained. They had all been destroyed, consumed in a firestorm of sacrifice that achieved little more than tragedy. Their story is one of the most haunting in naval history. Great ships built to project power across the Pacific, reduced to platforms for one-way missions, sailing not for victory but for death. The kamikaze carriers stand as grim reminders of a navy that once ruled the seas, now brought so low that its proudest vessels became floating coffins. Their final voyages symbolize the desperation of a nation unwilling to yield, even as the ocean itself swallowed the last of its strength. And so the story of the kamikaze carriers ends where the empire itself ended, in fire, steel, and silence. Once, Japan's carriers had launched the war with stunning triumph at Pearl Harbor. 4 years later, those same decks were stripped bare, their planes sacrificed as human weapons, their hulls converted into nothing more than platforms for death. The strategy was born of desperation. The Japanese High Command knew they could not match America's overwhelming industry. For every carrier Japan lost, the United States built 5 more. For every pilot who dove to his death, America trained dozens with better planes and better fuel. The kamikaze carriers were not built to win. They were built to delay the inevitable, to bleed the enemy in hopes of bargaining for survival. Yet their sacrifice only deepened the tragedy. Thousands of young men, many barely trained, launched from decks that had once carried the finest aviators in the world. They soared into the sky knowing their fate, believing their deaths would protect their families and their homeland. But the enemy they faced could not be stopped. Okinawa fell, Japan's cities burned, and the war pressed ever closer to Tokyo. By the time surrender came in August 1945, no Japanese carrier remained afloat. The grand ships that once ruled the Pacific were gone, either resting at the bottom of the sea or reduced to twisted hulks in shattered harbors. The kamikaze carriers had fulfilled their grim purpose, but they could not alter history. Today their memory is a warning. They remind us that even the mightiest fleets can be broken, that desperation can turn pride into ruin, and that war consumes not just ships and steel but entire generations. The kamikaze carriers were the last cry of a navy that had begun the war with thunder and ended it in silence, sinking beneath waves that still whisper of their tragic fate.